Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Today I'd like to talk to you about the mental abilities in D&D, things like intelligence and wisdom and charisma, and how do you play those and handle those in your game? How much do you use role-playing with an E versus role-playing with a double L? Now I personally prefer the older versions of D&D, so things like First Edition and Basic, and I DM a mixture of those, but I play in games like Pathfinder. And the older versions and the newer versions of the game handle those mental abilities very differently. Like in a game like Pathfinder, you'll have things like sense motive and bluff checks where you're actually rolling a die and modifying that die roll based on your intelligence or your wisdom or your charisma, and this die roll means success or failure. There's not really anything like that in the older versions of the game, except for maybe like the reaction roll, where you're going to meet, a person on the street or an NPC party or a group of monsters, and you're going to roll some dice to see how they react to you, but you're going to modify that based on your charisma. But the problem remains, that a lot of times, the player is going to be playing a character that's, has a vastly different intelligence or wisdom or charisma than their own. So how do you handle that? As a player, do you play this character like you, or do you modify your behavior based on their ability scores? If you're a DM and your players really aren't modifying their behavior accordingly, what do you do about that? Do you handle this mechanically or non-mechanically, or what do you do? Now, in terms of the physical ability scores, there's no way that the player's physical prowess or lack thereof is going to affect things like strength or dexterity or constitution. The 98-pound weakling that plays the barbarian with the 18 strength is a D&D icon, and there's no way that this guy's lack of strength is going to affect this barbarian's ability to pick up big, heavy rocks and swing an axe. It's just not going to happen. However, his intelligence might affect this barbarian's intelligence unless you're careful. Now, as gamers, let's say that we probably have a little bit more intelligence than the average population. In terms of wisdom, we'll be charitable and say we're probably on an even keel with the normal population in terms of common sense. As far as charisma goes, let's be honest, we're playing a kind of a geeky hobby, so let's just say perhaps, on average, gamers might be a little less charismatic than the general population, and leave it at that. Now, in the game itself, you're dealing mostly with stated actions. Players are telling you what their characters are going to do. Hopefully they're doing that because that's the whole point of the game. Oftentimes, those stated actions are enough, and they're not, metagaming or playing way beyond the abilities of their character in terms of what's on the sheet. And the classic stated action is the idea that the players go into a room, they see some kind of trap, like a pit trap. There's a lever in the wall, and some player realizes this is kind of related to that trap, and they say, hey, let's drive an iron spike into this, the slot where this lever goes, and this way the pit isn't going to be able to work. And that's just brilliant. At that point, you're just like, hey, this works. You don't need to roll dice or do anything. That's a great idea. And many times you can run most of the game based on stated actions alone. Now, other times you're going to need to kind of modify die rolls based on these stated actions. So let's say they come up to another trap or something, and somebody comes up with a pretty good idea, and you're really not sure how this trap works anyway, and you're like, you know what, to remove this trap, normally you would have a 30% chance of success, but because you came up with this really great idea, we're going to say it's 60%. And stuff like that can often work, and you can do stuff like that for intelligence or charisma or whatever. For the most part, though, I prefer people to play their characters like it says on the sheet. Like, that's what I do. If I'm playing somebody that's really dumb, then I might make him impulsive and do some stupid things. If I'm playing somebody that's really smart, I play him as smart as I can. Ditto for something like wisdom. When it comes to charisma, if this guy has a low charisma, I may make him a little bit irritating. And if he has a high charisma, I'm going to do my best to be charismatic. The bigger problem arises, though, when somebody's playing their character too bright or too wise or too charismatic or not charismatic enough. So generally what I like to do as a DM is kind of filter the stated actions of the players through the ability scores of their characters. I have a DM cheat sheet where I know the ability scores of every character that the players are using, and other pertinent information, hit points and armor class and all that junk. And so if somebody let's just say they're not really that great in social situations, and they do their best at a flowery speech or trying to convince, an NPC through what they say their character is saying. And I'm like, what, your character's an 18 charisma, this works. And sometimes you don't even need to roll dice for the most part for this, because you realize that they gave it their best try, and their character is really charismatic or really intelligent, so we're going to just let this go because that's going to work. It becomes a little bit more problematic when somebody has a really dumb character and they're playing them like they're, Albert Einstein. And so sometimes you just have to say, to the player, hey, look, try to tone it down just a little bit. You know, you're this big beefy fighter, you got all these, you know, all the strength and magical weapons and everything else. Could you kind of tone it down in terms of like how bright this guy is? Other times though, it's no big deal, because, you know, as long as they keep it to like out of character stuff where you're coming up with tactical stuff, then that's no big deal. You know, other times I'll filter stuff in other ways. You know, I don't like to use perception checks as such in like older games, but there's nothing wrong with doing something where like the characters are searching through a room, and I'm going to say, you know what, if you have a 15 intelligence or higher, you're going to notice blank. So I'm going to look and say, okay, well, the really smart guy notices this, this, and this, and the dumber guys notice these other things. And, you know, I don't think that's unfair. I don't think you necessarily need to roll dice to do, you know, something like that. You know, and various other things where intelligence or wisdom might come into play. I'll either let things happen automatically, or perhaps every once in a while make a roll. And if I do, I need to make it for them, because you know, if somebody misses something, a perception check, you know, you shouldn't know that you missed anything. So every once in a while, I'll just roll dice to see how they sound. And every once in a while, they'll mean something, and that's how I handle junk like that. But for the most part, that's what I try to do, is just filter the stated actions of the players through the actual scores their characters have. As much as possible, we'll try to get people, and I'll try to play my character as written on the sheet, but other times you're just going to have to filter, you know, what they say they're doing through the actual ability scores of the character.